You'll know by now that I'm blunt and straightforward, and we have a policy of no bullshit. You'll also appreciate that millions of people have tried to change themselves with varying degrees of sincerity during the past few thousand years. World religions and philosophical movements have collectively generated a lot of genuine interest. Yet they've all failed. Let me say that again, so it really sinks in. They've failed. Miserably failed. There's no evidence down the ages of any notable success. They simply haven't delivered. Suffering continues. Psychological avoidance carries on unchecked. Hypocrisy is still the elephant in the room. Me first, selfishness, remains ubiquitous. You can't even point towards any realistic progress, a few steps forward, because there's been none. To be clear, I'm not saying that fundamental change isn't possible. It definitely is. But there needs to be exact and relevant knowledge for this to occur. Until recently, any information has been vague and grossly incomplete. Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone less than 150 years ago. Then came the fax machine and cordless phone. More recently, it's progressed into the mobile or cellular phone. Now a smart device that can also send and receive text messages and emails, take, send and store photographs, play videos, games and music, access the internet for all kinds of information, double as an alarm clock and calculator, and much more. So we're obviously an intelligent species, able to work out, replicate and use something that's advantageous. If we've done this with the phone in a relatively short time period, why have we failed to achieve any kind of significant change in ourselves after thousands of years of effort? Isn't psychological maturity even more important than being able to communicate over distance? We've already looked at what's been previously missing, the 16 key factors, plus what's got in the way, frustrating change, avoidance, during earlier films in this series. But the long history of failure has created additional problems, which you need to be aware of. As soon as you start searching for that something more, you get stuffed. There's existing pollution. The waters have already been muddied. There are all kinds of beliefs, myths, preconceptions, falsehoods, truisms which aren't relevant, and so on. It's been and still is a case of the blind leading the blind, or, at best, the partially sighted. Yes, there's often good intentions, but these are worth nothing when there's an absence of precise knowledge on how to succeed. Huge numbers of people have gone along with a load of half-baked nonsense. Many still do. The most relevant word here is gullible. Critical thinking has frequently been absent, with little or no probing questions directed at the chosen sources of alleged wisdom or teachings. Contradictions and hypocrisy have been commonly overlooked, astonishingly so at times, making a poor situation messier. I'll undoubtedly piss off quite a few viewers by saying what I'm about to say, but here goes. Meditation has been traditionally encouraged as a technique to attain enlightenment. Millions of people have practiced it, over 2,500 years, some seriously, others less so. And it's resulted in no fundamental change whatsoever. Zilch. OK, it's perhaps helped a bit with relaxation, as a minor side effect, but many things achieve this same outcome without all the fuss, ranging from watching a movie to having sex. Too many have prematurely opened their mouths to teach or preach when they should have remained quiet. Newcomers are immediately ensnared into this unfortunate mess of the blind leading the blind. It's disingenuous, and it stinks. If you look at the diagram, the two boxes represent selfishness and non-selfishness. The aim is to shift from the smaller mindset, selfishness, coloured red, to a bigger and better way, non-selfishness, coloured blue. The benefits are actually far bigger than I'm able to show in the limited space available, but I'm sure you'll get the idea. However, that's not what's been happening down the ages. As there's been incomplete knowledge, made worse by dodgy teachers, claiming to know when they really don't, it's created a false situation. This next diagram illustrates what's actually been happening. You'll see that the goal of the blue box is no longer there. It's now been replaced with a red-blue box, a mishmash of what's real and what's not. So those wanting to change have been chasing an illusion. People who don't know better, but should be able to expect better, have been conned, taken for a ride. They've been climbing up a ladder that's leaning against the wrong wall. If you don't know what you're doing, with nobody reliable to show you the way, then you won't get there. This point is well illustrated by the following story. It involved Ian, who's behind the camera. He'd previously been to Sudan just once to discuss plans with the authorities to set up our long-term humanitarian projects there. He was now back again, this time with a Land Rover and trailer full of medical drugs and equipment, etc. We were to work in a remote village and refugee settlement called Al Dasid, featured here on the cover of one of our books. We did so for 25 years. Anyway, Ian had first travelled there by helicopter. Now he got directions to get everyone and everything there by road. A top government official provided the instructions. After hundreds of miles, they eventually arrived at the large village of Suki. Ian had been told to ask here for additional instructions on how to finally proceed to Al Dasid. But nobody had ever heard of the place. Several hundred locals gathered around, all doing their best to help, were stumped. Not giving up, Ian mentioned that he'd previously travelled there by helicopter, landing at a nearby village called Salma, where there was a small government office. Thankfully, one local knew of Salma, solving the problem. 6 months later, Ian met the top government official again, a genuinely nice guy. It turned out that he'd written many papers and reports about the 3 Suki refugee settlements, of which Al Dasid was one, even giving a presentation about them to the United Nations in New York. He was knowledgeable, but he'd never actually been to Al Dasid himself. The large village of Suki was in the same local region, but about 50 miles away and in the wrong direction. It's a good story, insightful, showing what can and does go wrong. There are too many generalisations and not enough exactness. Thinking you know is not the same as actually knowing or doing. And the Sudanese official sincerely apologised, by the way, although he'd been genuinely doing his best to be helpful. People usually don't want to admit or even consider that they've been fooled, misled, getting a number of things wrong. Avoidance kicks in, supported by hope, a lousy substitute for exact know-how. And so the farce continues. It's all too easy to just play at changing, especially when your past expectations in life have generally been mediocre. Playing requires less effort, and you don't have to really challenge yourself. Dubious teachings are more likely to be swallowed because there's insufficient discrimination to spit them out with disgust. But this infantile situation is not exactly what was promised. What happened to the dream of fundamental change, of greater understanding and a bigger love for all? It's the mother of all letdowns. So my job's far from easy, which is why you need to be yourself as you study hard, learning the process, thinking clearly, putting everything into practice. The shift from selfishness to non-selfishness is not a continuum. A common error is failing to identify the start line. People invariably don't stand back far enough to gain the necessary wide perspective. What they do instead is merely try to get better along the spectrum of selfishness. Of course, selfishness isn't all bad or mediocre. It also includes good or even outstanding behaviour. But it's still selfishness, definitely not the potential which has been glimpsed. There's no radical transformation. The starting points are completely different. Selfishness is me first, or me and mine. Non-selfishness is everyone together, interconnected, as one. There's a diagram in Actions Speak Louder Than Words that clarifies this confusion about the start line. How you begin thinking, the very first assumption that you adopt, is crucial because this sets the foundation stones or parameters from which everything else emanates. If the start line is wrong or limited, what follows will be flawed or restricted. From birth, the social conditioning of monkey do what monkey see has determined behaviour. There's always the option to pause and question what life's all about, to begin the journey to a higher perspective. But you're nevertheless still shackled by that initial assumption of separateness. This self-orientated perspective alone makes fundamental change hard to properly comprehend or accomplish. As you might have already wondered, how can you jump from one starting point to another if there's no continuum? This is only possible temporarily, as a oneness experience or brief glimpse. And it's not immediately sustainable because your existing mental framework for living life is incompatible with this newfound better way. So a complete rethink is required. You have to examine the two alternatives of selfishness and non-selfishness, knowing there's a choice. You need to learn and apply the 16 key factors more and more because capability is necessary for being the best you can be. Simultaneously, you must see through and weaken the strategy of avoidance, as it will always frustrate change if ignored. Poor past social conditioning has to be dumped, flushed away. Changing is a step-by-step process. One discouraging aspect is having to look at yourself, warts and all. Most like to think of themselves as being a basically good person, which might be kind of true if you're not taking the bigness of human potential into consideration. As we've said before, the trouble with most people is that they don't want to know what the trouble with them is. They're content to sell themselves short. Yes, they might desire change, but they don't necessarily want to change. This is where having the spirit of an adventurer comes in. Courage. If you heavily depend on avoidance, flatly refusing to face reality, you'll probably not even begin this process. You'll turn away, looking for something less challenging. You need to be sufficiently curious and intelligent enough to study our process, to be willing to see what's what. Not that it's rocket science. As you start to progress, you'll begin to see the shit. The years of accumulated baggage, which doesn't exactly make you feel wonderful. But at least you found something real and you're starting to wake up. You then move another step or two forwards, getting a bit psychologically healthier, further lowering your defensive barriers, and you see even more shit. The reality is that for a while you're likely to feel yucky about yourself as you increasingly face how things actually are. At this point, you absolutely must keep going, onwards and upwards, pushing through any times of self-doubt. As you climb higher, your perspective will improve. Yet again, you can understand the superficial appeal of playing at changing. It's less demanding. You don't need to grow a pair or two. That's balls and antennae for detecting bullshit, by the way, in case you've forgotten. Instead, you can go to meditation or yoga classes with a friend, followed by a nice cup of coffee or herbal tea. You'll feel slightly better for making the effort to be more spiritual or whatever, before returning to the drudgery of your everyday existence. I keep mentioning the title of AC/DC's song, It's a Long Way to the Top If You Want to Rock and Roll, because this is a long journey if you're serious about changing yourself, shifting from selfishness to non-selfishness. And if you've already been at it, perhaps years before coming across our work, you'll only now be in a position to genuinely get going. To repeat, most never even identify the actual start line because of inaccurate information, including a lack of scale. An illusion of change is created, different from the real deal. Human potential is much more, far bigger than most people care to believe, think or consider. Shifting from selfishness to non-selfishness is the next step forward in evolution, which is a significant event. The history of failure will continue until this is all understood. You can't miss out something which is essential. The process is the process, and it must be completely applied, with no cherry-picking or confusion. There can be no substitute for exact knowledge. That'll do for now. I'll see you again soon.